Welcome on into a Big 12 football schedule reveal here on KSLSports.com. Mitch Harper, Steve Bartle. We cover all things BYU and Utah here on KSLSports.com and the KSL Sports app. Steve, we have been waiting for this schedule to come for what feels like weeks, months, and now it's finally here. The 2025 Big 12 football schedule is here. How you feeling, man?
Man, it's exciting, right? You finally get to see the schedule. It finally feels like you know your path, right? That you have to take. And I think that's exciting. It allows people to start scheduling road trips and figuring out travel plans and that sort of stuff. This is a big step in the off season for all of us here. It's a big one.
It definitely, helps paint the picture of, how these games stack up, can really determine potentially who plays in the Big 12 championship game coming up on December 6th in Arlington, Texas. The defending champs, of course, Arizona State. For BYU, 11-2 a season ago. Utah looking to have a bounce back year in 5-7 a season ago. We're going to be breaking this down here throughout the day. You can join us here and interact with us on X, YouTube, all the social medias. We're going to be unpacking this. We got a bunch of content too already on KSLSports.com. But we got to start things off, Steve, in Salt Lake, the game that matters the most to the people in our part of the country in this league, BYU, Utah. The Big 12 continues to go outside the box and reimagine this rivalry. The date, October 18th in Provo. What are your thoughts on the Cougs and the Utes in year two in the Big 12 in October now?
Yeah, interesting to say the least, right? I mean, it was interesting that it was early November this past season, but at least you had the bye week, right, to prepare for it, to kind of build up the anticipation around the game and all the storylines. And now it moves up even further into the calendar, and neither team is going to be coming off a bye week. And so it's just a unique dynamic. I know Utah is going to be coming off the game against Arizona State, and BYU, you've got what, 4 games straight before that Utah game. That is the 5th of 6 straight games for BYU. It's just an interesting decision to place that game there between both schedules, to say the least. I think a lot of people would love to see that game in the final week of November, throwing back to the old days in the Mountain West when that game was played. But it is certainly an interesting choice. And, I do wonder, if the 2 weeks of buildup was just too much for either program to handle, right? It is a lot of buildup for that game.
It was a lot, even just for us in our profession covering the teams, but I can only imagine it was a big deal for both the teams on the field too. And we saw a little bit of a letdown after that game too. I mean, it was an emotionally draining game for so many. BYU won that game 22-21, but I think what was interesting about that game was that that one was November 9th, and that was the second weekend in November, but it delivered a huge late night television audience. Yep. It was 2 million people. BYU at the time was number 9 in the college football playoff rankings, and it was an epic finish. And, Steve, when you go back in the history books of BYU and Utah, you think there wasn't many games where in the series where both teams were maybe undefeated and had a conference title on the line in that final week. Most of the time it was just bragging rights. And, I can envision a scenario, not necessarily this year, we'll see how it plays out, but a day eventually where maybe BYU and Utah are both 6-0 and you're playing in mid-October and maybe the whole nation is, locking into BYU and Utah. That's maybe optimistic thinking because we know with how the Big 12 lands in these TV things, it seems like it's all SEC and Big 10. That's all that matters to ESPN and Fox. But still, BYU and Utah, I think, shows that when there's someone that's got a ranking and got a chance to be in the national conversation, people are going to tune in more than ever before. And it's noteworthy, too, that this game now takes the spot that Texas and Oklahoma used to occupy in the middle of the season. So maybe the Big 12 is indirectly saying, hey, we want this to be the new Red River in the conference.
I think there's a lot to that. And I think what I was looking at, I was trying to get a feel for what other games are being played that week. And I noticed Alabama and Tennessee are playing that game, which we know is a big rivalry. But outside of that, there aren't too many, high profile games of this magnitude. And so, yeah, I do think this is essentially the Big 12 saying this is a key rivalry in our conference. We're going to highlight it. It may not be what you're traditionally used to, but let's roll with it. And I think it'll certainly be interesting to see how it plays out, come October.
200 days from now, the Big 12 football season kicks off when Kansas State goes to Dublin, Ireland to take on Iowa State.
Wild.
Big 12 clash, 200 days from now. Can't wait for that. When we dive into the local teams and the schedules, and 12-game slate again, and some of the nuances of this year's schedule, 2 bye weeks once again for all the teams in the league. And that's because the week 1 start date is in August, and that creates a situation where you get 2 byes. And I think that's an interesting dynamic when you're looking at where those byes land. For BYU, it's in week 3. To me, that's not ideal to have that early of a bye week. You want to kind of get some rhythm, get things going by that point. But still, bye on week 3, and then they got to bye November 1st. And Utah's got their byes on October 4th. Or
week 6.
October 4th, and then November 8th as well.
Yep. So week 6 and week 11 for Utah, and that's more what you want to see with your bye weeks is a little bit more into the season, right? As you were mentioning, Mitch, Utah's going to have 5 games to open up the year to kind of build that rhythm. They do have 2 tough games to open up Big 12 play at home against Texas Tech. I think the Red Raiders are going to be, a pretty tough out this year, given what McGuire returns and what he's adding to that program in the transfer portal. And then Utah is going to go on the road to West Virginia, and then they get to enjoy that first bye week before they, get into the most difficult portion of their schedule in October. But getting that bye week coming out of that in week 11 allows them to prepare for the final 3 games at Baylor, at home against Kansas State, and then on the road again at Kansas. That's pretty ideal for Utah. I shouldn't. It's more than fair. I think it's a pretty good placement for Utah where those bye weeks come, and I think they'll be able to, as you said, build that rhythm early on and then carry it throughout the season, getting rest at key junctures on the schedule.
What caught your attention when you first saw it drop at 9 a.m.? What caught your attention on Utah's schedule?
Yeah, Texas Tech to open up. As I mentioned, that's going to be an interesting one. The 2 teams haven't played since the 70s, and so to welcome the Red Raiders to Salt Lake City to open things up, Utah is going to get we're going to get a pretty good idea of what Utah has against the Red Raiders, in the very first week of Big 12 play. And then again, talking about the bye weeks, those stand out because again, week 6, getting that first bye allows them to prepare for Arizona State coming to town, the reigning Big 12 champs. Kenny Dillingham has done a lot to rebuild that program, and he's going to have another contending team, in my opinion, next season with Sam Levitt and what else he returns and what he's added through the portal as well. So then you've got the BYU game after that, and Colorado, who is going to be coming off of a bye week. Getting that first bye in week 6 is pretty key for Utah.
Looking at the Utah schedule, it was very noteworthy to open up with Texas Tech. I think that could be a really big game in the league. Texas Tech's got one of the best transfer portal classes in this 2025 cycle. They come into the KSL Sports way too early power rankings at number 5. This could be a team they're pumping in a lot of resources into their program more than ever before. They've got a just stunning practice facility, student athlete building. They seem like they're all in to take this thing into overdrive. That could be a big one to open things up for Utah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a tough test. And as you said, there's a lot of momentum there in at Texas Tech with what they're doing, not only in football, but in basketball as well. There's a lot of interest and invested folks that are optimistic that Joey McGuire can continue to build upon this and continue to build, the Red Raiders into a perennial title contender in the Big 12. And with the money that they're investing in the program, as you said, Mitch, one of the top transfer portal classes, in the country, not just the Big 12, in the entire country. They've added a lot of key pieces, particularly in the trenches. I think Joey McGuire, like I said, that's going to be a difficult first test for Utah, and we'll learn a lot about what Utah has and their chances in the Big 12 next season with what they're going through on the offensive side and the changes that they've made. We'll learn a lot about Utah football in that game.
BYU opens the season at home against Portland State. Then they go Stanford, an ACC foe, comes to Provo for the first time since 2003. A bye week. Then at East Carolina, they open Big 12 play with the Colorado Buffaloes. First time since 1981. BYU is going to go to Boulder. The quarterbacks in that game for BYU, Jim McMahon, and then he gets banged up, and then it was Steve Young. It's been a long time since BYU's played in Boulder, but that's how they open up Big 12 play. I think it's awesome move to see that game be a Big 12 lid lifter for BYU, because that Alamo Bowl, and that's the hat I'm wearing right now, that was quite a game for BYU. And you got to think Coach Prime, the Buffs, they're going to have revenge on the mind. It's going to be a new look group, but I think the talent that Colorado's acquiring in the portal and the fact that Coach Prime is staying in Boulder, I think there's a lot of excitement still for the Buffs going forward, because I don't think many of us thought, Coach Prime was going to be around by year 3. He was going to be off to the NFL and moving on. I think it's pretty cool he's still there in Boulder.
Yeah, Colorado, they're going to look quite different, right? With what they're losing in Travis Hunter and Shadur Sanders. They're going to have a heated quarterback battle, in my opinion, with Liberty transfer Caden Salter coming in, as well as, highly touted freshman Julian Lewis. That quarterback battle is going to be fascinating, and I think play a key role in Colorado's outlook for next season. They've added a lot through the portal, particularly in the trenches. Again, they've added some key pieces from SEC programs to bolster their defensive line and offensive line as well. So I'm with you. I'm genuinely surprised to see Coach Prime still in Colorado going into year 3. But he's got that program trending in the right direction, and they're going to be another top contender in the Big 12 next year.
Some other notes on BYU that kind of stood out to me was the Big 12 home opener for BYU. It's a Friday night game, October 3rd against West Virginia. West Virginia makes its first ever trip to Provo. Rich Rod, they go back to the future. What's the Matthew McConaughey quote? Sometimes you got to take a step back to move steps forward. I don't know what it is, but it's a little bit of a Back to the Future vibe. Maybe Steve Slayton, Pat White show up. I hope so. My 20-year-old self hopes that happens, because I love those guys. But I think that's going to be a really good game, because I think Rich Rod, he produces dynamic offenses. I mean, we saw it back when he was in the Pac-12 at Arizona. He even got the Wildcats, where they won the Pac-12 South once upon a time. He's going to get West Virginia rolling. And then some other games that really caught my attention with BYU was UCF to close out the season. The Knights are going to be traveling outside the state of Florida to close out a regular season for the first time since 2014. So it's going to be the namesake of their coach, Scott Frost. It's going to be frosty for those Florida guys in Provo in November 29th. So those were some games that really caught my attention. But I think the schedule sets up pretty well for BYU, who comes into our KSL Sports Way Too Early Power Rankings at number 1. High expectations for BYU. Let's see if they can live up to it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, right? With what they bring back and given that schedule, they've got a tough stretch there between October and November at Iowa State, at Texas Tech, then coming back home to TCU. That could be a really tough, coming off of the rivalry game the week before. Man, that's a really difficult stretch. This is the first time I'm really looking at BYU's schedule. That's a tough 4-game stretch, and then you go on the road to Cincinnati and you finish up with UCF. Man, that final stretch for BYU, that's a lot. But as we learned this last season, they certainly can handle it. But that's a tough test for sure.
When you talk about final stretches, we'll go back to Utah, at Baylor, K-State, at Kansas. Kansas could be a Friday or Saturday. I thought that was a little interesting tidbit. That's quite a close too. K-State, I think they become a model of consistency. They were the Big 12 champs back in 2022, but with Chris Kleiman, they're always going to be in that 8 to 9 win threshold. He was kind of upset when people are asking if 9 wins this past year was a bit of a down year. And he's like, I don't want to get in that business because this was a really good year. And then at Kansas, Jalen Daniels comes back.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really tough stretch for this new look Utah team offensively that should be much improved. They come into the KSL Sports way too early power rankings at number 9 in the league.
Yeah, so with Utah, that those final 6 games, right, to go on the road to Provo in October, and then returning home against Colorado. We've already talked about them and what they've done, but then they welcome the Bearcats to Utah to kick off the month of November, and then they get a bye week in the second week of November. I said earlier, more ideal placement of your bye weeks. I think getting that for the final 3 games will help Utah in those matches because, Baylor, they figured something out this past season about midway through the year. It looked like, Dave Aranda was on the outs in Waco. They turned it around. Sawyer Robinson turned into one of the top passers, not only in the Big 12, but in the country. He finished with 28 touchdowns to just 8 interceptions. And, he's a guy that can throw it all over the yard. He can throw it deep, and he loves to throw it deep. And so, Baylor's added some key pieces from their recruiting efforts out of high school and in the transfer portal. So that's going to be a tough game. Playing Kansas State in Salt Lake City, November 22nd, that's going to be a vital game for Utah. That's a must-win game for Utah. Kansas State with Coach Kleiman, they've done a good job of adding key pieces, of retaining most of their roster, adding some talent from the high school ranks. They added a 5-star tight end in Lincoln Cure, who's certainly going to come in and make an impact right away. And then to finish up with Kansas, Kansas is going through a major, makeover as well. I think they've lost about 40 players from their roster this past season, but they bring back Jalen Daniels, who's going to be in his 6th year as a quarterback. And so, he's going to be, at one of the top quarterbacks in the Big 12, at least during the offseason, in the offseason conversations and all that. But I do think, it's a difficult stretch for Utah to finish the season, but it's manageable given the fact that they do have a bye week, and you've got a couple home games in there as well to manage that.
He's Steve Bartle. I'm Mitch Harper. You can interact with us on YouTube, X. We're breaking down the 2025 Big 12 football schedule. Hot off the press. It's brand new. We're seeing all 16 teams, year 2 in the Big 12 conference, and what we learned in year 1 of this 16-team era in the Big 12, Steve, is we should probably expect the unexpected. Last year, the preseason 16th pick, Arizona State, they win the league. And Arizona State is going to be, I think, really good. You noted Leavitt comes back, but the Sun Devils, they open things up at home with Northern Arizona in non-conference play. They go at Mississippi State out of league, but then they've got their Big 12 opener at Baylor. I think that's going to be a really good game. And I really believe that Arizona State with Dillingham, they're built to have some long-term success. This has always been that program that's always been dubbed that sleeping giant potentially. I think the addition of Kanye Udo from Army West Point's it's hard to replace Cam Scattaboo, but that's a pretty adequate replacement. A guy that ran for 1,100 yards a season ago. I think Arizona State's going to be really good once again.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think Kenny Dillingham has that program trending in the right direction. He has a lot of momentum, on the field and off of it with what they're doing with their with their own NIL situation. They've added some key pieces at the skill positions to help replace, Cam Scattaboo. You're not going to replace him with a single individual just because he did so much for the Sun Devils during his time there, especially this past season. But I do think they have a lot of playmakers that can step up and emerge. Raleek Brown was a highly touted prospect at one point, 5-star, even transferred from USC to Arizona State. He wasn't able to get going this past season due to a nagging hamstring injury, but he's a talent that can come in and help pick up the slack. And then they've added a couple other running backs from their high school recruiting ranks as well. And so, I think Arizona State, they're trending in the right direction, and they're going to be a top contender in the Big 12 again next season. I think Kenny Dillingham has not only added key pieces, at the skill positions, but he's gone about building within the interior, the trenches, the right way. And I think a lot of those guys are starting to hit their upperclassmen years, and so you think Arizona State, they've still got plenty of room to grow as a program, so they're going to be one of the toughest outs in the Big 12 next year.
This might be a radical idea because coaches probably would not go for it because they want to plan ahead who their opponents are going to be year after year. These opponents were known for quite some time. The schedule matrix has been out for about a year and a half now. We know the opponents up until 2027, but I really wish there would have been a BYU Arizona State matchup again this year because that was spicy in Tempe. And with Utah, the Utah hosts Arizona State. That's always spicy too when Utah and Arizona State clash. Arizona State just kind of brings that out in these Utah teams, don't they?
They sure do. They sure do. And it's it's a lot of fun. There's been a lot of heated matchups over the years between Utah and Arizona State, and obviously BYU got a pretty good taste of that last year. And I think there is certainly a distaste between the Utah programs and Arizona State, and I'm with you. I would have liked to see that game played in Provo this season. It would have been certainly a lot of eyeballs on it, to say the least.
Yeah, with these schedules, 9-game conference schedules, and then you've got your own team, so you miss out 6 opponents, and that's kind of one of the unique dynamics of these inflated conferences is that you're going to miss a lot of teams. It's weird to think that, these conferences that you're going to go a season where, for you covering the Utes, you're not going to have to worry about 6 of these teams. The same for me. It's just kind of different. It's something you got to get used to, but that's life in this kind of, again, inflated conference era that these leagues are in. Last year, Arizona State took down Iowa State in Arlington to win the Big 12 championship. Those two teams, when we talk about rematches, they're going to square off in Ames November 1st. That should be a good one. And Iowa State's kind of interesting. They had an 11-win season a year ago. They won the Pop-Tarts Bowl over Miami. They bring a lot back. Rocco Beck has been a 2-year starter for them. He's back again. Iowa State, can they break through and win the league? I mean, last year, first time they've ever won 11 games, first time they've ever won double-digit games. Now it's to take it, can they get to the playoff? That's what's your early thoughts on the Cyclones in 2025?
Yeah, it'll be interesting with the Cyclones because they do return, a good chunk of their roster, a key piece at quarterback, as you mentioned, in Rocco Beck. But they're losing some significant talent, at the skill positions. Their receivers, Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, Darian Porter at cornerback, those are talents that are hard to replace. They have added some key pieces from the transfer portal, particularly at that wide receiver spot. So, I do think they'll still be one of the top contenders despite what they're losing. And what'll be interesting with Iowa State and even Kansas State as well is given the fact that they are playing a week earlier, August 23rd, they actually get 3 bye weeks over the course of the season, and how that helps them navigate the year is going to be really interesting to see. They don't have more than, outside of the opening 4 games for them, they only have 3 game stretches with how their bye weeks break up the season, and that can be pretty manageable for these coaches. So Iowa State, I think is going to be at the top of the league again. They're going to be a tough out again. And Kansas State, can Avery Johnson take that next step? He didn't live up to the hype that he had coming into last season. There were high expectations for him given the talent and some of the flashes that he showed. I think he learned a lot of hard lessons. What sort of leap does he make, and how does Kansas State better handle this schedule given the fact that they have 3 byes and they'll be looking to make steps, progress of their own. So, it'll be interesting. And Mitch, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. What do you view as the most difficult stretch on BYU's schedule?
I'd say the toughest stretch is that Colorado that 5-week stretch of at Colorado, West Virginia, at Arizona, Utah, at Iowa State. There's no breathers there. And to have no bye after the Utah game, that at Iowa State game, I would probably say way too early. That's probably an L. That's probably a tough spot to go into. That is a difficult stretch for BYU, and for BYU this season, it's not going to be the chip on the shoulder commentary this year. Kalani
Right.
Sitake in Vegas at Big 12 Media Day, he's like, we know. We'll show you. Like, it was almost like we know what we got, and he was absolutely right. When all of us were thinking maybe 6-6, 5-7, at best 7-5, they delivered an 11-2 season. That's going to be a unique dynamic for BYU. And even Kelly Papinga, hopped on the KSL Sports Zone a few weeks back and said that's going to be the challenge for BYU, is how do they manage expectations, because Kalani's best teams have always been the underdog, or they're a group that have, oddly enough, a quarterback battle going into season. Jake Retzloff has to take a massive step forward for BYU. I think a lot of this team hinges on the leap that, Jake Retzloff makes. Aaron Roderick, believes that he could be a 30-plus touchdown guy with single-digit interceptions. That's what he has to be. That's in the mold of Zach Wilson, Jaron Hall. And when you're talking about that, that's an NFL quarterback. So can he take that jump? And if he can, BYU could be in the hunt to go to Arlington, because I think a lot of their position groups, particularly in the trenches, are going to be pretty strong. I think they've built enough depth that they're ready to compete week after week, as we saw last year in a power conference. So I think that's, but that stretch, though, with 3 of those 5 coming on the road, that's tricky. And then just the high emotions of that Utah game, it just was a real stark reminder of how emotional that game is. And when you have it in like a September or October, November, wherever this game is played anymore, that following week can be real deflating. And BYU experienced that losing to Kansas at home when they were the number 6 team in the country. So I think that's the toughest stretch. What about for you? What do you see as that toughest 3 to 5 game stretch for the Utes?
Yeah, fortunately for Utah, they don't have a really long stretch like BYU does in the middle of that schedule with where their bye weeks come. But that month of October, with Arizona State coming to Salt Lake City, going down to Provo, and then welcoming Colorado in Rice-Eccles Stadium the next week, with Cincinnati coming up after that, what sort of state is Utah going to be in coming off of the BYU and Colorado games for that Cincinnati matchup, right? That'll be certainly interesting to see, but that's going to, that's a tough test. Like we were talking about with Arizona State and Kenny Dillingham, he's got that program trending in the right direction. They're going to be coming off a bye the week before for that game as well. So both teams are going to be well prepared for that game. And, for Utah, given the changes that they've made on the offensive side of the ball, with Devin Dampier coming in, offensive coordinator Jason Beck coming in, the identity shifting back to more of the run game under Kyle Whittingham, I think will be really key for Utah. Finding more efficiency and more consistency with Dampier as a passer will be key to Utah's potential and their ceiling next season. But I think just having a consistent and dynamic run game can do a lot, because as we saw this past season, that even despite the offensive struggles, that Utah's defense is going to show up week in and week out. They finished as one of the top defensive units in the Big 12 and the country. ESPN Plus, Bill Connolly and his ESPN SP Plus ratings had Utah as the top defensive unit in the country last season. And so, if Utah can get just a little bit more, even just a little bit more out of the offensive side of the ball, that'll help them, contend at a higher level. But if they can get the run game going with a little bit more efficiency and consistency out of Devin Dampier as a passer, Utah's going to be right in the thick of things as well.
One of the things that really caught my attention on Utah's schedule, and it's talked so much in these in supersized conferences, is travel. All these long distance trips. Utah does go to Morgantown, West Virginia, and that's an underrated trip. I think that's one of the better spots in the league.
Yeah, that's one that Utah fans were hoping would come early in the year so they could make that trip. I don't think anybody was interested in going to Morgantown late in the year, but that is certainly one I think Utah fans will travel to.
But I think what then catches my attention is that they don't leave the state of Utah again until November 15th. So that West Virginia game is October 4th. And then you've got a bye, and then you've got 4 straight games, 3 of which are at home, and then the other is at BYU. So you don't leave the state of Utah for 6 weeks? So
6 weeks.
That's pretty good. And when you're managing these long distance trips, and the Big 12 tends to kind of have a rule of thumb where if you have a 2 time zone game, they're going to give you a bye the following week. BYU didn't get that luxury. They're going to go at Cincinnati in Ohio, a little bit closer than West Virginia, but then they come back home to close it
A
out
little.
against the UCF Knights. It is crazy.
Yeah,
These
only
long distance
slightly
trips.
closer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's these long trips. I'm sure it's just it's still surreal to think, you know, BYU, Utah, they play games in Orlando, and it's a conference game. It's just the new world
It's
of
wild.
being
Yeah.
in college football in 2025. Any games, Steve, that catch your attention maybe in non-conference play in Big 12 around the league that maybe you feel like could be really interesting, whether it's BYU, Utah, whoever on the non-conference portion of these schedules early in the year that you think could be some really good games for this Big 12 to really kind of plant their flag that this is an improved league in 2025?
Yeah, obviously, starting with Utah themselves, they'll be on the road August 30th in Pasadena, California, taking on the UCLA Bruins in the Rose Bowl. I think you'll see a lot of red in the stadium for that one. A lot of Utah fans will make that trip, so that'll be a big one. Obviously, UCLA, not the toughest Big Ten competition, but still, given the dynamic of being former Pac-12 mates and all that, there's a lot of familiarity between the programs, and so that'll be a rather interesting one for Utah in the Big 12. Another one that catches my eye: TCU going on the road to North Carolina. Given what North Carolina has brought in to the program with Bill Belichick, that's a great opportunity for the Horned Frogs to go into North Carolina and pull off a surprising, maybe big upset. You know, we don't know what Bill Belichick is going to be, what he's going to do for the Tar Heels and that football program, but that is certainly an interesting one that could be really good for the Big 12 if the Horned Frogs can pull it off. Those two jump out at me. What about you, Mitch? What are a couple that stand out to you?
I love that TC North Carolina poll because that's
Yeah,
Labor Day night. Chapel Bill is what they're calling it. Yeah, that's a good one. Baylor and Auburn in week 1,
that'll be
and
a good one.
Auburn's coming to Waco. So getting any SEC team to leave their terrain out of league and not have it be a
Yep.
neutral site,
It's a
that's
big
awesome.
deal.
It is a
Yeah,
big
it's a
deal.
big deal.
And for Baylor too, getting them at McLean Stadium, I thought Baylor was one of the hottest teams at season's end. I know their bowl game was lackluster against LSU in that Texas Bowl, but Baylor had one of the most explosive offenses in college football. Auburn, they could be a preseason top 15, top 20 team when you look at some of the way too early forecasts. That could be a real early season knee-jerk reaction, tone setter for maybe the Big 12 and for Baylor if they really want to, climb back the ranks and get back to, being a Big 12 championship contender. They did it just 4 years ago. That's the thing is that Dave Aranda has won a title in this league, and he, got some of that momentum back into that program. I mean, I was there in Waco last year when BYU beat him, and BYU opened that game up 21-0, and that stadium was lifeless. I thought there is no way this guy is going to survive, not getting fired, but somehow they
Yeah.
turned it around. They've got
Yep.
talent, and as they say, they're paying players more than ever before now. So Baylor's got the resources and the talent to go blow for blow with Auburn. I love that game is in Waco in Big 12 territory. Some other games that really catch my attention. I know this is weird because it should be a Big 12 game, but Kansas State at Arizona.
At Arizona.
That's the quirky game this year of you experienced it last season with Utah and
Baylor. Yep.
Kansas State goes to Arizona in week 3. Arizona, I'm really curious to see what they become. Noah Fifita changed the number to number 1. He's going back to his old Servite high number. He returns after some, reports that maybe he was going to go into the portal again. It was the second cycle of that, but he's running it back. Teteroa McMillan's gone, but Brent Brennan's got to have a big year because they completely disappointed in year 1.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that Arizona is going to be fascinating. I think, if you're talking about coaches on the hot seat, Brent Brennan is, towards the top of that list, given what they've done, what they failed to do last year and what they had on that roster. Pretty surprising. Two other games that have now since caught my eyes. I've taken a closer look. Oklahoma State going on the road to Oregon. Just be competitive, Cowboys. Just be competitive. Don't get your doors blown off. Be competitive. look competent, and hold your own for the Big 12. And then Texas Tech, with the Oregon theme, will welcome Oregon State to Lubbock. And look, that's not a game that jumps off the page as a marquee matchup, but Texas Tech struggled against Washington State this past season. And so, if the Red Raiders are who we think they could be this year, to paraphrase Dennis Green, they are who we thought they were, right? I think we have to see Texas Tech take care of business pretty emphatically against the Beavers in Lubbock, Texas there next year.
I love that pull of Oklahoma State and Oregon, because the week prior, Oklahoma State plays UT Martin. That's an FCS game. You should be able to take care of business there, of course. Yep. So a whole offseason of Mike Gundy and his revamped staff, with Meekum as the OC, Grantham as the defensive coordinator. Mike Gundy, man, that guy can draw it up. I know they were
never know
last year. Maybe they can make it competitive, but Oregon is recruiting at just an insane level.
Yeah.
But hey, it's a statement opportunity for the Big 12, and 200 days from now, it gets going, Steve. We cannot wait when this thing kicks off in week 0. And then, of course, we'll be covering BYU and Utah better than everyone, and we'll be going in depth throughout the Big 12 football season coming up this fall. So for Steve Bartle, Mitch Harper, and behind the scenes, Nate Dowdle, we appreciate all of you tuning into this Big 12 football schedule reveal for the 2025 season.